In this video, we're going to talk about the mechanism of action of opioids. The mechanism is pretty confusing at times. It could be a little bit complex, but we're going to try to simplify it to just keep things pretty straightforward and give us a nice framework of how opioids work and where they work. So if you look over here, let's start off on this side. I already started drawing just to save a little bit of time. But if you look on this side, our opioids are going to work. This is our triangle of anesthesia. Our opioids are going to work at this point here, providing analgesia or pain control. So our opioids, in order to understand the mechanism of action, let's first understand how a painful stimulus travels up the brain or up a peripheral nerve, goes into the spinal cord, up to the brain, and then the brain interprets that as pain. So I have a little drawing here just to help us out. So let's say we have a stimulus here, whether it's putting your hand on a stove or a surgical incision. That stimulus is going to release inflammatory mediators or chemical mediators of pain. And those include, but they're not limited to, mediators such as bradykinin, substance P, different cytokines. Adenosine is one of them, and glutamate is another. So you have this stimulus, it releases these chemical inflammatory mediators, what have you, and that signal, that painful signal, gets picked up by this first set of nerves. And these set of nerves, there are a couple of different types of nerves, but for the purposes of our example, we'll talk about two different types of nerves. There's the slow traveling C fibers, and then there's the faster traveling A delta fibers. So there are different neurons that conduct that signal, that painful signal at different speeds, and then it dumps that signal into the spinal cord. So now we're at the central nervous system. And the specific location here is the dorsal horn of the spinal column. So from that point, that signal gets picked up and travels along the second order nerve up to the thalamus. And at that point, there's a third order nerve that gets that signal, receives that signal. The thalamus interprets that, it processes that information, it sends it up to the cortex. And at that point, your brain perceives that stimulus as painful. So that is how a pain signal generally travels. So now that we know that, let's try to figure out where opioids work. And this is kind of a trick question because opioids can work at any point along this painful track. Opioids work at any point here, and any point there. So now let's talk about our mechanism of action. Just going to scroll down here. So our opioid receptor. Our opioid receptor is a G protein coupled receptor. And let's see what happens when an opioid, so this is going to be our opioid. When our opioid binds to its opioid receptor, this binding is going to have an effect on 4 different things. And that's why the mechanism of opioids are pretty complicated. But trying to simplify it into these 4 mechanisms of how opioids work. So the first mechanism is the opioid binding to its receptor is going to inhibit adenyl cyclase, and that is going to prevent the conversion of ATP to cyclic AMP. And if you look down here, the ultimate goal of creating cyclic AMP in this scenario is to transmit your pain signals through gene transcription, etc. So if adenylyl cyclase is inhibited, then ATP can't go into cyclic ANP, and therefore this whole signal or track is stopped. So in addition to, so that's number one. I'm going to label it number one, inhibits adenylyl cyclase. The second thing that the opioid binding to its receptor will do is it'll increase phospholipase C, and that has a similar end goal to prevent signal of pain traveling or propagating up to the brain. So I'm going to label this as 2. And there are 2 more things that opioids binding to the receptor will do. The third thing is they're going to work at the presynaptic and postsynaptic neuron. If you look here, the signal will travel this way, and then ultimately the pain gets transmitted. So the other thing that opioids do is they prevent the entrance or influx of calcium into the presynaptic neuron. And by preventing that, that'll prevent signal transduction of that pain pathway. The other thing that opioids are going to do, they're going to work at the postsynaptic receptor. And what they're going to do is they are going to increase the efflux of potassium at the postsynaptic neuron. And what that's going to do is that is going to hyperpolarize this postsynaptic neuron, decreasing in action potential, decreasing the transmission of pain. So I'm going to write this as number 3. And 3 includes the calcium, inhibiting calcium going in and stimulating potassium to come out. And then the last thing that opioids are going to do is they are going to send downstream signals from higher centers in the brain to stimulate or to create an analgesic downstream effect. So essentially what they're going to do is they're going to send analgesic signals down the higher centers of the brain to the spinal cord to combat the upstream painful signals. And these downstream signals are going to be stimulated in the periaqueductal gray and the rostral ventromedial medulla, the MM. So I'll label this as 4. So that was a lot. To quickly summarize, we know how pain is transmitted. There's a stimulus, there are mediators involved, they travel up 3 sets of nerves. The first set of nerves go into the spinal cord, second set of nerves into the thalamus, and the third set of nerves to the cortex, and that's how pain is interpreted and perceived. Opioids work at any one of these, along any area of this pathway. And opioid binding to its receptor, its G protein coupled receptor, will do 4 things. The first thing, it'll inhibit adenylyl cyclase, it'll stimulate phospholipase C, and that prevents pain signals. These 2 prevent the pain signals from propagating. The third thing is it's going to prevent calcium from going into the presynaptic cell, preventing signal transduction. And then likewise, it's going to stimulate potassium efflux to create a hyperpolarized state in the neuron, again, to decrease that pain signal. And then the last thing that it's going to do is it's going to send analgesic inhibitory signals down the spinal cord to combat the upgoing painful stimuli.